Cruising by Fore. Narrated by Otis Jiry. It was almost midnight when Kyle said, "Can we go back now? They found a body out here 2 weeks ago." Typical Mr. Tough Guy. He used to carve magical symbols into the desks in high school. He liked black t-shirts with gory graphics on the front, and he carried a 7-inch double-edged boot knife. But he was always afraid. "Shot," he said. "The guy was shot 5 times and dumped in a ditch." I told him he was going to end up a cranky old man who stayed at home and never had any fun, and he shut up for a while. We were ripping down the roads between Dixon and Davis in my 68 Chevelle, doing about 80. When I picked Kyle up at 10, I told him we were going to the bars just to get him into the car. I really wanted to see how the new engine would run, and I hated riding alone. Kyle started complaining in no time, but those were my drinking days, and once I got an idea in my head, God or the devil couldn't change my mind. I veered off Road 132, jerking the wheel so that Kyle smacked his head on the window. I laughed. He swore and rubbed his head. We came to the crossroads, and I rocketed down the left fork, headlights bleaching the narrow dirt road, sickly gray in front of us. Glancing over, I caught Kyle smiling. I think he was beginning to enjoy the ride. He told me to slow down as soon as we saw the taillights about 7 car lengths ahead. But those were my drinking days, and my buzz was pretty good that night. I sped up. "Don't follow them," Kyle said. "You idiot. We don't know what they're out here for." But I had to see where they were going. The car in front accelerated, increasing the gap. The taillights blinked out over the crest of a hill. I gunned the motor and followed. They disappeared. We came over the hill, and there was only the darkness stretching out beyond the headlights, and the endless fields of dead, whispery grass on either side. Clouds of dust and bugs swirled in the headlights as I slowed to a stop. "What's up?" Kyle said. He was gripping the handle of the door as if he were getting ready to bolt. I stared into the grass. Tall enough to hide in, I thought. Hide or just wait. I told Kyle to relax. We were going back. Bruce Springsteen had just come on the radio, singing a sad song about his hometown, and Kyle said, "I think that car is after us." I shot a glance into the rearview mirror. There were lights, but not that close. I told Kyle he was being paranoid. I stepped on the accelerator, and the needle climbed to 70. When the car was no more than a few hundred feet away, they switched on their high beams and continued gliding closer. The lights bouncing off my mirror made me winch. Bastards! I jacked the speedometer up to 85, and they were still gaining. The radio mumbled weakly over the roar of the engine. Stinging white light flooded the car as they rammed my bumper, making the steering wheel jerk in my hand. Kyle screamed, and I yelled at him to shut up. I had a plan. I got the speedometer twitching spastically at 90, giving us only a few inches between ourselves and the other car. I screamed at Kyle to buckle up. When he did, I jerked the car to the right, off the road, plowing the car through the tall grass and hoping to God a stump or a tree wouldn't materialize in front of us. I fought to control the wheel over the uncertain terrain and waited for those peculiar few seconds of weightlessness before the car would slide into a roll and crush us to death. We were lucky. After I managed to stop the car, Kyle dived out of his side and puked. I got out and stood against the hood, catching my breath. The night smell of dry grass mingled with the heat from the engine and the sting of my sweat. Kyle got back in the car and sat there without closing the door, his arms tightly crossed. After listening to the crickets for a few minutes, I joined him. Dire Straits was on the radio. "Cool song," I said. "Shut up," Kyle said. He slammed the door and we headed home. Just before we got to the crossroads, there was the car. It was also an older model, a green Dodge Challenger with the end jacked up, parked across the street, blocking it. I slammed on the brakes and we skidded to a stop. I left the motor running and got out. I stood next to the open door and screamed, "Do you have some kind of problem?" Someone in the other car called out, "No, you do." The window on the Challenger's passenger side rolled down. There were explosions, wild strobe light flashes as the machine gun fired. A bullet shattered my left shoulder, and I slammed against the ground on my back. My windshield exploded, and there were muffled cracks as bullets riddled my car and bounced against the ground. I managed to sit up, stoking the searing pain in my arm. My vision dimmed, and I fought it. Shielded by the open door, I managed to get into the driver's seat. The motor was still running. All I had to do was step on the gas and drive. I looked over at Kyle and froze. He was leaning against his door, mouth gaping, his face washed in blood. His dagger sat uselessly on the seat beside him, inches away from his frozen hand. By the time I realized the shooting had stopped, it was too late. A voice next to my ear said, "Bye-bye." And then there was the usual click-click, the hammer of a revolver being drawn back. He shot me 6 times, blowing my brains out with the first bullet. That was months, or maybe even years ago. All I know for sure is that I'm still here night after night. I read somewhere about what funny places crossroads are. They used to bury vampires and witches there to confuse them if they should come back. Another book said that crossroads are focal points for psychic forces, energy that can attract lost spirits and imprison them too, so it seems. Once, a police cruiser drove by, slowed down, and the driver shined a floodlight into my direction. I hoped that if he could see me, maybe he could hear me too. I stood there, waving my arms and screaming as the light swept over me. But he drove on after a few seconds. They all drive by, except for that one night. I was sitting on a stump near the edge of the road, basking in the farmyard smell of the tall yellow grass, lulled by the mantra of crickets. It didn't sound like a car at first. The wind distorted the sound, adding an animal rage to the roar of the motor. I stared at my feet and waited for it to pass. The car, a Barracuda with racing tires and a blower on the engine, was a lacquered midnight blue. It must have been going about 70 when the driver slammed on the brakes and slid to a stop. The driver turned off the headlights and rolled down his window. Hey, buddy." Slowly, I walked over. The smell hit me a few feet away from the car. The stench of dead flesh roasted, of boiled blood. I froze, and the driver called out, "What's the matter?" I didn't move. I flinched as he popped the latch and slowly opened the door. It was Kyle, and he was smiling. He said, "What'd you think?" and stood next to the car with his arms outstretched so I could get the full effect. The black leather jacket, encrusted with chrome spikes, the black T-shirt with some god-awful drawing, all fangs and dripping blood, the silver death's head belt buckle, and tattered jeans, and the gleaming black jackboots, straight out of some Nazi fantasy. "Look, Ma," he said, "no more bullet holes. And there's this." He reached inside his jacket, withdrew an impossibly large dagger, and waved the blade slowly, hypnotically in front of my face. He said, "Nice, huh?" I just nodded. You move around?" I asked. He leaned against the car with his arms crossed, the picture of nonchalance. "Oh, yeah," he said. "I go places you wouldn't believe. I'm sort of a messenger and delivery boy." He ran his fingers lovingly down the spikes of one sleeve. "My people are very accommodating." "Your people?" "Anyway," he said brusquely, "I just had to stop by to show you something." Grinning, he sauntered over to the trunk of the car. He didn't use a key to open it, just thumped on the top, and it opened. "Voila," he said. A cloud of that same dead stench floated out. I gagged and turned my head. "Don't be such a baby," he said. The 2 sacks in the trunk were about as large as grocery bags. In the moonlight, it was hard to tell what they were made of. It might have been burlap. Both were darkly stained. Kyle grabbed one and hoisted it out like a farmer lifting a chicken by its feet. He said, "Meet the bastards who killed us, buddy." He lifted a man's head out of the sack by its hair and held it stiffly out to me, like some black leather centurion presenting a trophy to Caesar. Flies and ants traced crazy patterns into the eyes, onto the lips. I wished desperately that the eyes were closed, those bulging, panicked eyes. They were the worst part. At least I thought they were, until the tongue twitched, and the slack mouth began to work furiously, mouthing curses or prayers. I screamed and stumbled back, tripping over my feet and falling into the dust. I couldn't move fast enough. My arms and legs went into rubbery rebellion, and I flailed on the ground. I settled for crawling and began scuttling into the field. "Stop!" Kyle commanded. I froze when I heard his footsteps behind me. I stood up and faced him. He smiled and put the head back into the sack. "Better?" he asked. "I don't remember you being so squeamish." He tied a loose knot in the top of the sack and tossed it into the trunk. It landed with a thud. "There," he said. "Show and tell's over for tonight." He slammed the trunk shut. It's what he said before he left that had me worried. He was back in the car, revving the motor, and I had turned to go to wait out another night. He called, "Hey, buddy," as if a thought had just occurred to him. I turned around. He was leaning out the window, smiling again. "Why don't you come with me? It'll be all sorts of fun." I told him, thanks, but no thanks. When he spoke, it was through clenched teeth. "You know," he said, "you're going to become an old man who never leaves the house and who never has any fun." I remembered the words, and I realized, behind his smiles, he still blamed me for what happened. He hated me and wanted to take me to his people, along with those miserable creeps in the trunk. He roared off in a furious spray of dust and gravel. I hope he doesn't come back.